the session where we can actually pause and talk to each other, and I am going to pose some questions for you, and this will be an opportunity to lift up some of the questions that you all are posing. So if you've got a question, drop it into the chat. Like I said, there will be lots of opportunities for us to answer those questions and to engage in some dialogue. I'm going to share my screen so that you can see my slides. And just a little bit about me. I've been working at the intersection of health and education equity for about the past 25 years. Most recently, as a consultant, I have worked with DC's charter school community around the pandemic. And before that, I served as the Director of Health and Wellness for DC Public Schools, where I developed and led all of our LGBTQ programs and supports. I also want to make sure that I mention that I'm a proud DC parent of 2 young adults, one who graduated from a DCPS high school and the other who graduated from a DC public charter school. So as I have said before, this work indeed is truly personal as well as professional. I'm very excited to be here with all of you. A review of the group agreements. I'm going to ask that everyone please be present so we can prioritize this time that we have together. It's after school. You could be somewhere else, but you're here. So let's be present together. Create and provide grace and space for each other, and especially for yourself. We're learning in this journey together. Also practice active listening as I speak, as other people share. What do you want to take in from what is being said? Ensure full confidentiality. The conversations that we're going to have here today are important for this session. Our conversations will be pulled out and edited out before they're posted on the learning management system. So we're going to protect and ensure confidentiality in that way as well. And please make sure that you do ask. I really want to encourage you to drop your questions into the chat. So, and that is how we all are going to learn, is we'll pause and lift up those questions. So my job today is to make sure that at the end of our hour, all of you will be able to do these 3 things. So I want you to be able to explain and differentiate what is meant by transgender and non-binary gender identity. I want to make sure that you're able to draw connections between inclusive and supportive environments and decreased risk of severe mental health outcomes using both national and local data. And I want to make sure that you'll be able to articulate age and grade appropriate strategies for talking about gender with young children. So how are we going to do that? We're going to cover some terminology that's beyond the binary. We're going to talk about what transgender and non-binary students need to be successful. We're going to talk about how do you talk about gender with students that's both age and grade appropriate. We're going to talk about identity being layered, right? We come into this world not just with one of our identities, but with all of them together. In particular, our transgender students, many are students of color. So we're going to look a little bit about race and ethnicity and think about that and share some strategies around that. And then there will be a session evaluation. It will be important for you to complete the session evaluation. I want to send everybody here a certificate of completion, and I'm able to give you and issue you a certificate of completion if you do 2 things. 1, be here today for this session, and 2, at the end of the session, complete the session evaluation. So with those 2 things completed, I'll be able to give you a certificate of completion. So now, before we get started, I want us to spend just a moment centering ourselves as we think about a time in our lives when you felt at odds with the expectations of your family, your peers, or your community regarding your gender. I'm going to say that again because sometimes it can sound a little confusing. So think about a time when your actions, decisions, behaviors differed from what your community, your parents, your peers, your other family members sort of expected of you and how you were going to perform or be or show up as your gender. Perhaps you wanted to be an astronaut, but you were a girl, and in your community, people told you that astronauts had to be boys. It's a basic example, but that's just sort of one example I'm giving you about think about when that may have happened for you. And think about a time when you were the only in a room. We've all been there. We've been the only one of our kind. How did you feel, and how, if at all, did it impact your experience? So I'm going to invite you to drop that in to the chat. Everyone receives a certificate of completion for each training that they complete. So you come to one training, you complete the evaluation, you'll get a certificate of completion. And so we ask you about your name and email address in the evaluation so that we can connect that. And it's only connected for us to be able to give you a certificate of completion. We're not trying to connect it to your answers in the evaluation. The answers in your evaluation will be separate from your name and your email address. So someone's brother got a science set when he was a kid that looked really cool. And this participant wanted to play with it, but was told that it was only for boys and not for girls. I think that we hear that a lot. Certainly my mom told me about the time she was on a TV show as a child, and she got to pick a prize on the table of some like local children's show. And she walked over to the table to pick a prize, and she picked up a tool set. And the folks that were there tried to get her to put it back. And she's like, no, I want the tool set. And she walked off with her little tool set. But yeah, we see that a lot. Um, once someone was the only white person on the metro, and it felt noticeable to her right away.
I think like as a mother and like as a wife, like family members would sometimes say, but you shouldn't do that. Like, you know, your husband should be the one to do it. Like you shouldn't do it. Or if I want to plan to do something and it seems like it's out of it shouldn't be like it's not feminine enough to do. So many times like they'll just, you know, try to tell me not to do it because I'm not a man.
Mm-hmm. These are great. Thank you all for lifting those up. I appreciate you engaging. And so we're going to continue to pause and engage like that with each other. So drop questions in and we'll keep answering them in these moments. So now beyond the binary basics, I want to get us on the same page. First, from a values perspective, let's get on the same page. So what does the U.S. Department of Education say to us? They say that every student deserves to learn in a safe and supportive setting, free from discrimination. So that's a quote that I pulled out from Supporting Transgender Youth in School. That's a document that's published by the U.S. Department of Education. Also, I pulled up OSSE's core values, and all of our schools in DC are funneling up to OSSE, and our core values in our different local education agencies also should be reflected in the core values of OSSE. And so at OSSE, OSSE believes in the potential of all students, from our infants to toddlers all the way to our adult learners, to learn and achieve at high levels. We believe that a critical part of our role as a state education agency is ensuring greater equity in outcomes for our students by accelerating progress for those who are furthest behind. And these are two values that I think that we can all get on board with. And so as we think about how do we welcome and include our students who are transgender and gender non-binary, let's keep these values in mind, the values of our organizations and our institutions. And also I want us to spend a little bit of time right now thinking about what are our own values. So what are your values? Why are you an educator? And again, I'm going to give you several options to participate. We saw folks take themselves off mute and participate. Some folks drop things into the chat. And also you may just be thinking about this in your head or writing it down on your own notes. And that's also a way to participate. So what are your values? Who would like to share? And why are you an educator?
I can share. For me, advocating for the, people with less privilege is really important to me. And I think that can show up in multiple ways, whether it's a transgender student in a classroom that um, where they're not the majority, or whether it's like women in a setting of all men, or there's just so many scenarios that it could play out. That's really important to me. And that's a big part of why I'm here and also why I'm in education.
Great, thank you. And also, someone else is saying that to aid in providing a level playing field, right? That is also how we, our passion is to, can be to really level the playing field for students.
I think I just wanted to like jump in really quick and just say too that I think um like a big reason why I'm an educator is because I feel like education wasn't big in my family and it wasn't something that my family had access to and that they could easily get. So I think like part of my value is like valuing education and valuing those spaces that I can create to give students that space.
Great, thank you so much. And so when we think about our students who are transgender, how could supporting them align with your values and the values of your school? How does supporting a student who's transgender align with your values?
I mean, for me, it's like them feeling comfortable enough to have their voice heard, I think like, so they know that they have a perspective and they have a right to have their point of view heard, whether it's in how they're expressing themselves, like what, all the different elements that, go and I'm not, I don't know that much about it, which is why I'm here. But for me, it's just really important that like their voice is respected.
Great, thanks for giving that. And you don't need to know a lot about a student that might be different than you to know that helping them feel seen is part of your, aligns with your values, and that you can do that. So we've also got to ensure that everyone has access to what they need to succeed. I recognize that even in a minority group, I still have privilege because of my education, my job, my economic status. I want to be sure every other person can achieve their goals. So whatever I can do to advance that aligns with my value system. And I hear that a lot from educators, even educators who may share some identities with the students in front of them. They're still recognizing that their privilege kind of places them in a different place, and they ought to work a little bit harder to make sure that they fully help a student be seen, because their identities can impact their learning environment, and thus they need a level playing field leveled for them. Great. Thank you all so much about that. So we talked about some terms and definitions the last time we were together. Because today's session is focused exclusively on gender identity and transgender identity and non-binary identity, we're focusing on those definitions only. And so I'm just going to review these quickly. Someone who may tell us that they're transgender, they're telling us that the gender that they understand themselves to be, which lives in our head, that is our true understanding of who we are, that may be different than the gender that they were assigned at birth. And typically that gender is given to us by just sort of a visual scan of our genitalia. Our DNA is more than likely not being tested to confirm a sex. It's just sort of from a visual sort of scan. And so people who are transgender are telling us, like, the way I've been labeled as, particular gender since my birth is not who I know myself to be in my head. And so some people we've learned through some more recent data that about 70% of people who identify as transgender identify as non-binary. And so those are folks who are telling us that they don't actually subscribe to a gender binary, that they may exist between or beyond the male, female, man, woman binary. You may have heard some words like people identifying as gender fluid or gender queer or gender nonconforming, gender expansive. Those are some ways in which non-binary people will tell us that how they identify themselves, how they understand themselves to be. And then cisgenders are the folks whose gender identity and what they understand themselves to be more closely aligns with the gender that they were given when they were born. And then the last time we met, we talked about the gender unicorn, which is one of my favorite ways to visualize and show gender, show that, you know, to talk about gender identity and to train adults around understanding what gender identity is. And so the Gender Unicorn was developed by the Trans Student Educational Resources Organization. It's a group of young transgender people who told us that actually our gender, the way we understand it, it's not sort of on a spectrum that still sums to one, but it really is sort of degrees that may exist separately from each other. So I can feel my identity can be sort of, you know, this degree of female, this degree of male, maybe this degree of something else. And that it's not just sort of so connected into sort of like 70%, 30 to give us the one. And then our gender expression is a term that I didn't define on the previous slide, but it's an important one. And that is sort of how we perform our gender, how we show up for our gender, the way we wear our, or, you know, our clothes or style our hair, intonation of our voice, those types of ways in which we present our gender can also be complex and fluid and expansive and may not align neatly on a spectrum. In the middle, we've got that sex assigned at birth, or what some people will say our gender that's assigned at birth. That's when you're born. The medical professional there gives you that gender assignment. And then at the bottom is a topic that we're not going to talk about today. We talked about it a little bit the last time we met, but today we're gonna sort of cast it off aside. So they're split up by your gender and then your sexual orientation. The gender is like who you understand yourself to be, and your sexual orientation is who you may be physically or emotionally attracted to. That's sort of terms like lesbian, gay, bisexual. Those are all sexual orientation terms. And then transgender, non-binary, that goes into the gender identity term. And it's important for us to know that these are sort of the way people identify, but it's also that real or perceived thing. When we talk about sort of how people may be at risk at school, it's not just because of the way that they identify or the way they understand that they're expressing themselves, but it's also the way other people identify them and other people understand their expression to be. So we see that kids who are sort of LGBTQ or are perceived to be LGBTQ can experience discrimination at school in similar ways. And so we're going to pause here and think about what's something new, maybe that you've heard about gender identity or gender expression today in this session, or perhaps something recently in the past year that something new that you've heard about gender identity or gender expression. And just lift up that learning.
For me, the last part of the unicorn was new, like the who are you emotionally attracted to?
Mm-hmm. Right. So when we think about sexual orientation, when we put on our adult hat, we sort of rush to the sexual, right? So where you're sexually attracted to someone, you know, your sexual orientation is even starts in the word you know, the term sexual orientation is who we're sexually attracted to. And we may be straight or lesbian or gay or bisexual, but what we know is that, especially when we talk about young people, they may be emotionally attracted to somebody. Sex may not be at all part of this. They're not even developmentally at a place where they're even thinking that way, but they may already know who they might be emotionally attracted to. Especially as we see kids get into older elementary and into middle school, they are maybe emotionally attracted people, but not actually thinking sexually. Gender identity and gender expression doesn't need to match. The gender identity and sexual orientation are two things. Right. I learned recently about sexual orientation and how it is different from how people identify. I just started sharing more with my network about two-spirit folks who fall within the non-binary spectrum. Right. And so we see a lot of cultures will have sort of some of this two-spirit identities or a more and different kinds of non-binary identities. Great. Thank you all for sharing all that. Let's talk about the need. We're all here because we know that young people need us and why we know that there's a particular reason why we need to focus on transgender students. And, a lot of the work that I do with schools is to really help them from policies to implementation, sort of develop a school culture that is inclusive and supportive of transgender students. And the reason why schools will hire me to do this work is because they already are seeing that students who are transgender are vulnerable. And what we know from data that we're going to talk about briefly is that these students are at much higher risk for severe mental health outcomes compared to their cisgender peers. But what we know, and we talked about this in our last session, is that you all have the power to change that narrative. You all, as educators, have the power to affirm, to welcome, to accept, and create supportive environments. You can be that trusted adult for a young transgender student of yours, or a non-binary student, or someone who's trying to come out to you. You can be that trusted adult so that you can be at least that place in the school where they can experience affirmation and welcome. And that practice of just being that person for them can reduce, even significantly reduce, rates of severe mental health. And we're going to talk a little bit about suicide over the next couple of slides. But first, I want to just tell you how many students are transgender in our schools. When we ask middle and high school students in DC about their identity on the Youth Risk Behavior Survey that OSSE administers every 2 years, we've learned that 2% of our middle and high school students are transgender. And what is important for me when I do work with schools is that since from 2019 to 2021, the percentage of middle school students identifying as transgender has doubled. It went from 1% to 2% in 2 years, which makes a lot of sense for me. Most of the calls that I receive from schools are from elementary school students, from elementary schools whose elementary school students are coming out and saying, I'm actually not a boy, I'm a girl. Or some kind of variety like that. And so that makes sense to me that we are starting to now see our middle school numbers trend up. And I suspect that may be a trend that we continue to see. Now, why don't we know about elementary school students? We don't ask them. And why the survey starts at 6th grade. And why don't we specifically know about our 9 non-binary students? Well, we don't ask a question about being non-binary yet. We ask only about being transgender. And I will also tell you is that because they're only 2% of the population, even though there are more transgender people than redheads out there, it's still a small enough number that once we start breaking out transgender from non-binary, we may have numbers that are so small that we wouldn't be able to actually report out on them, the N, right? So the math teachers in the room will, we can talk about the N, the number size. We want that to be big enough so that we can report out the data without disclosing something that's private because they're such a small group. And what we know about these students is that they are more likely to experience risky behavior and also miss school because they don't feel safe. And so this is a suicidality slide from the 2019 DC Youth Risk Behavior Survey, where we can see how our transgender students are at significantly higher risk of contemplating suicide, making a plan for suicide, or actually attempting suicide. And that number all the way on the right really scares me, that nearly half of our transgender high school students have attempted suicide 1 or more times in the past year. And for me, that gets me up every day. It gets me motivated to do this work because these are numbers I want to see trending down and not trending up. And the reason why I do these trainings is because of this data right here, because you all are the solution to a lot of this. We know that adults at home, family support, teacher support, administrator support, all of these, start layering on these accepting adults, and students do so much better. LGBTQ students do so much better when they have adults in place that will accept them and affirm them. So you are here to be, to learn more about these students and learn more about ways in which you can talk about gender in your classrooms or with your students that you work with. And we reviewed this data before, but it really shows you that when we create open and affirming spaces for young people to use their chosen names, that we actually see, and this is a specific example for transgender teens. So when they're able to use their chosen name at school, at home, with friends, at work, all the places in the community where they go, we see significant decline in depression, thoughts of suicide, and in suicidal attempts. So pretty significant decrease. And it isn't rocket science. This is stuff we already know about other students and other identities. And again, what we know is that you can be successful in turning the tide for a transgender young person's mental health by continuing to affirm them and support them. And so I want us to think about how you might be able to support a transgender student. How could you be a trusted adult for them? And you can drop that into the chat, take yourself off mute, or even just think by yourself in your head or write it down in your notes. How can you be a source of support for a transgender student? You can ask them their preferred pronouns and provide own pronouns by asking questions, asking parents and family members how to be better support, how to better support, asking parents and family members how you can better support their student at school.
I'll share an example really quickly from that we've learned from some health educators in the district in how students like change for PE and use locker rooms. Some teachers have been very adamant about ensuring that students feel safe, and if they want to go to a different locker room that's not marked by this particular gender, or if there's not a gender neutral room, those teachers and educators have made space for those students to go to a private room, private restroom to change for PE or something like that. So moments like that help to support and affirm our students' identity.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for lifting that up. And also, just even engaging the young person in that conversation. Where do you want to be? Giving them some power. Like, where do you want to change? Where would you feel most comfortable changing? I know some coaches will also place a transgender student's locker in between a supportive friend group, so that when they're changing with their friends, or placing the locker even closest to the coach's office, so that the student knows that someone is keeping an eye out for them and has their back. Read books all year long about different identities, not just waiting for Pride Month. Great. Thank you. Ensuring that colleagues are aware that policies in DC exist to support gender identities. Great. So let's keep going. It's almost as if, that last comment was sort of there to cue up this next slide. So we've got lots of laws in DC. We're fortunate in DC. We have federal laws and local laws that help to protect our identities when it comes to lots of identities, including gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation. So FERPA, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, is one law that allows us to say, hey, my name and gender are wrong. This is my name and gender. So a parent of a minor or an adult student on their own can request a change in the student information system to change the name and gender marker. We also know that Title IX is a federal law that protects us when it comes to our gender identity and our gender expression, and also our sexual orientation. And in DC, we have the DC Human Rights Act, which is our non-discrimination law, and a lot of localities and states will have non-discrimination laws, and ours is called the DC Human Rights Act, and it protects us against discrimination and harassment for a bunch of our identities, including gender identity and gender expression. So our transgender students are protected in multiple layers in multiple ways by federal and local laws. And then we also have the DC Teen Bullying Prevention Act, which prohibits bullying and requires schools to have bullying prevention plans that explicitly include protection against bullying based on our gender identity and gender expression and sexual orientation. And then you'll see a lot of these laws and policies require schools to enact their own non-discrimination, bullying, and harassment policies. So you'll see at your own school, you probably have read your staff handbook or your student handbook, and you'll see mention of non-discrimination policies, bullying policies, bullying prevention policies, sexual harassment policies. All of those policies are policies that schools want to put in place, but they also are required of schools by OSSE, either directly through the federal government or through local law. And so that is where we derive our authority to then put in place policies that really benefit our transgender students and our non-binary students. So let's think about some of these kinds of policies. Let's think about how we can implement our values that we talked about earlier and marry them with the law and what is expected of us. So when I work with schools that are trying to be more inclusive of their transgender students, I'm looking for schools that are enacting policies or articulating policies based on their non-discrimination policies that allow students to use the name and pronouns that they want to use, either formally through the student information system or informally in class, in the hallways with their peers and with their teachers. And so it is the expectation that students be allowed to use the names and pronouns that they say, either whether it's formally with their parents changing their name and gender marker in the student information system or informally in practice. It also would be required by our non-discrimination policies per our laws, our local and federal laws, that we allow transgender students to use bathrooms and locker rooms that match their gender identity. Some of our transgender and non-binary students may say, I prefer a single user bathroom. And so it would be incumbent upon the school to provide that single user bathroom for the student. Another transgender student may say, I want to use the girls' bathroom. That aligns with my gender identity, and that's the bathroom I want to use, and that is the bathroom that they are allowed to use. And sometimes I get questions, and oftentimes they're hypothetical questions. What if a parent doesn't want their child to use the bathroom with a transgender student, and then that other student should be offered an alternative bathroom? But we can't kick out a transgender person because somebody else doesn't want to go to the bathroom with them. So for that other student, it would be the school's responsibility to find perhaps the single user bathroom might be a better option for that student if they feel uncomfortable. For the most part, it's the parent that might feel more uncomfortable, but their student may not share that discomfort that their parent does. So oftentimes, if it even comes up, it gets resolved fairly quickly because the student's just going to go pee where they feel comfortable, even if it means going to the bathroom with a student who's transgender, and the student may not have an issue with it. I also think about gender-based activities. So that's something that's important that comes up. We have in PE or perhaps with sex ed, sometimes teachers will segregate students arbitrarily by gender, and And our transgender students may not know where to go, or may try to go with their gender identity, the group that matches their gender identity. And there are a lot of students that really struggle with, where do I go? I don't know where to go, even if it means they may have to leave their friends to go in a different direction based on gender. So I really try to encourage schools not to segregate students based on gender. Where we do see gender segregation is at the athletic level. Usually in middle and high school, you'll have some sports that are segregated by gender. And for those, the DC Athletic Association, the State Athletic Association, has policies in place. And so transgender students are able to play on teams that match their gender identity, or if it's an individual sport that matches their gender identity. And I believe they only need a letter from their parent in order to do that. So we've got a pretty inclusive policy even when it comes to athletics. I'm also looking at dress codes when I work with schools, and I'm looking for two things. One, I want to make sure that your dress code is gender neutral, right? So it's not saying boys can wear this and girls can wear that. So that's the first sort of hurdle or threshold that I'm looking for. The second is that the dress code isn't requiring clothing of a particular gender, or prohibiting clothing that's typically worn by a particular gender. So what happens where in this situation is perhaps we start giving a long list of clothing items that are prohibited in our dress code, and they end up being clothing items that are typically worn by girls. And that gets us into some trouble when it comes, because we may be denying girls access to their education by separating them, putting them in the office, by calling the dean, by sending them home, which we shouldn't be doing anyway. But we may be denying them access to their education because we're now prohibiting items that girls wear typically. And so those are the two things that I'm looking for when I review dress codes. Also, it's important that we allow our students to form clubs. Some clubs are, gendered clubs by design, like Men Can Stop Rape clubs. There's the Men of Strength clubs on campus. There are also some other sort of, girl power clubs that are on campus. And then there's gender and sexuality clubs on campus. And it's important to know that even when we have these sort of affinity clubs, that anyone can participate in them. So we may have a Men of Strength club, and there may be someone who identifies as a girl who wants to go to it. They can be allowed to go to it. So again, it's very rare that we have strict rules that prohibit students from participating in things. And then we're looking at things like privacy and confidentiality. Is that specific in your policy? Are you really working hard to make sure that you are keeping a young person's information private? If they, I worked with a school before where parents enrolled their child and told the principal, my child is transgender, I don't want anyone to know. Well, what about the classroom teacher? No, I don't want them to know. Well, what about the nurse? No, I don't want them to know. Okay, well, and then, the principal called me and asked me, what do I do? And I said, well, the parents told you this is how they want it to be handled. So you're respecting that kind of privacy. And a young person may come out to you and not to anyone else. And I know we've got some social workers here today, and they may come out to you and be comfortable at being out as transgender while you are working with them in your office, but in the hallway, they're going to want you to call them by their old name. And so that is important. You're protecting their confidentiality and their privacy by honoring that they're not ready to be out in the hallway in the cafeteria, but they can be out with you. And then, of course, I'm looking for bullying and harassment prevention, and we've already talked about that, but living it and making it real. So it's not just to have it written down in the handbook, but I'm also looking for practices where you are actively interrupting harassing behavior and also preventing it moving forward. So I want you now to think about what policy could you improve at your school to improve the experience of transgender students, right? You all benefit and bump up against all the policies that are in place in your school. So think about a policy, if you were in charge, What could you change? What policy would you change or could you change to improve at your school or improve the experience of its students, transgender students in your school? Or maybe you recently helped to change a policy at your school that you hope will improve the experience of transgender students. I'd love to hear that too.
Well, I know at my school we just have boys and girls bathrooms, so that would be a challenge for a transgender child. So, but I don't know like what the options are in terms of facilities and things like that. So it's not easily fixable.
Yeah, most schools that I've worked with have there might be adult bathrooms that are single user. And because we're typically the teachers don't go to the restroom in the same bathrooms as the boys and the girls, and there might be a single user adult bathroom or a teacher bathroom. And so in that situation, you could make an adult bathroom available to a transgender student or a non-binary student who wasn't comfortable using a multi-user gendered bathroom. And sometimes in schools, like in some of the schools, those bathrooms are not locked, but the students know where they are. So a transgender student may know where that bathroom is and is invited to use that bathroom. Or perhaps there's a key. I know in one school that I worked with, they had the key and the key was right above the door, above the door frame. And that student, they had a transgender student who happened to be tall enough to reach up there. So they just told the student, hey, the key's right there. Go ahead and use the bathroom when you need to. And also in DC law, any single user bathroom in the district must be all gender or gender neutral. So we are not actually allowed to have single user bathrooms in DC that are marked as male or female. I know sometimes you can go into Montgomery County. I know you go to a Starbucks in DC, they've got two bathrooms that both say restroom. You go to a Starbucks in Montgomery County, you've got two bathrooms, one says female, one says male. So that is it's actually just the difference in laws. So let's see, let's lift up some things. We've got some great questions in here. Teen, why is the reason that teen is used in reference to the Bullying Prevention Act? It's just the name that DC Council gave it. I think that perhaps they were trying to respond to particular acts of bullying. But it doesn't apply to just teenagers. If you read the text of the legislation, it applies to all schools. And so a best practice for lodging for overnight trips, it's such a great question. When I work with schools, I always recommend, especially if you're getting on an airplane, that the chaperone go through TSA security with the transgender student so that if there's a problem, that the transgender student has the adult right there with them to help navigate getting through the security as a transgender young person. And then when it comes to lodging, I think it's important to ask the student where they want to sleep. When I worked with some schools that were sending students abroad every summer, we had several transgender students who traveled, and some of them wanted to be in sort of the dormitory style with the other boys, and others it was more of a hotel situation. And so we just asked them, like, hey, where did you meet some young people who are going to be on this trip that you might want to room with? And then we just connected with those young people and their parents and said, hey, this young person has identified that they'd like to room with this person. Is that okay? And it was okay. And so you find a solution that works for that transgender student. What I would recommend against is putting them alone in a room, because you don't know where to put them. I think that isolation is probably not in their best interest. And if you have any other particular questions, I'm happy to answer. If you've got a trip coming up, I'm happy offline to answer a question about that. I spent a lot of time working, especially if you look at the DC Public Schools field trip policy. At the beginning, there's a whole section on supporting transgender students. You could Google DCPS field trip policy, and you'll find the policy that we worked on there when I was at DC Public Schools. Even knowing the rules and policies in the school would be so important. Oh, you're not alone. I hear that a lot from teachers. Like policies, policies, we have policies. Yes, you have policies. And so understanding what those policies are is important, especially if you've got a student who is transgender. Like it's important to know those policies because you might be the person who's going to be advocating for that young person. And we're going to keep moving on because we're going to spend a whole lot of time looking at policies. Next Wednesday is our policy session. So I hope all of you will come. We're going to spend a whole hour just talking about policies. So thanks. I'm so glad to see that other people are interested in policies because it definitely is something I love to spend time talking about. So the last time we were together, we talked about when gender identity typically develops. And what we know from the American Academy of Pediatrics is that, by age 4, kids tend to have a stable sense of their gender identity. Not everybody. Kids develop at different points along their lives, but we know that around age 4, children tend to have a stable sense of their gender identity, which is one reason why a lot of elementary schools are asking for support around students who are coming out and saying, I'm not a boy, I'm actually a girl, or something like that. And what I would say is it's okay to talk about gender. Students do better when they feel seen and can see themselves in the curriculum or can see themselves in the school. We've talked about that before, and I don't know if I can get some thumbs up from you all. Have you ever heard of Radine Sims Bishop and her theories about the window and the mirror? That class school can be, curriculum can be and should be a window and a mirror for students. All right, I got a couple of thumbs up. It can also be a sliding glass door. And so what does she mean by that? So when you're an educator and you're designing curriculum, you can create a world and a curriculum that is a window for students to see out and experience and to learn about other perspectives and other cultures beyond their own. A mirror is where we can help to support our transgender students where they can see themselves in the curriculum. They can see themselves reflected in classroom practices and policies and things like that. And then that sliding glass door, it's like you throw that door open and you step right through it. And now you are experiencing a world that's different than yours. You're experiencing life that's different than yours. And so these concepts are important for not only students who are transgender, but students who are cisgender, because we all benefit from that window and that mirror and that sliding glass door opportunity and perspective. And it's important to you can use some inclusive messages. So these overall inclusive messages around gender, like everyone's gender is unique to them. Things don't have genders, people do. Now, as someone who grew up speaking Spanish, I will tell you, or I've heard people tell me, well, actually, words do have genders. And sure, maybe el libro is a masculine word for the book, but the actual book doesn't have a gender. The word is a masculine word, and we know that shows up in Hebrew and other languages. So again, though, the actual object does not have a gender. And someone's gender isn't always obvious by looking at them. And there's not just one way to be. And I think that's a big overarching message that you as an educator can share with your students. There's not just one way to be, and you know you better than anybody else knows you. But when we're answering questions about gender, it's always important to first clarify the question. We put really big adult interpretations onto little teeny small basic children's questions sometimes. Children can be a lot more concrete in their thinking and their questions than we are as adults. So I really want to encourage you to slow down. And my trick, my parenting hack is if I'm trying to slow the questions down so I have time to really understand what's happening, I will say to a young person, tell me more about that. Tell me more about that. And I'll just keep saying, tell me more about that. And that is a great way to help sort of run down the clock, give yourself some time to figure out like exactly what are they asking and what exactly is the answer. And then there you can also ask things like, is there a question you're asking or are you just curious? And is there a reason why you're asking or are you just curious? And that helps you clarify intention. And once you have a better sense of what the young person's intention is with their question, you can have a better chance of really putting together a an answer that meets the child's development and the question that's actually being asked. And so there are different ways to talk about gender depending on age group that kids are. We know, from Ages and Stages, the American Academy of Pediatrics Ages and Stages talks about at different developmental points where what young people are doing and able to do and able to understand. And so the Gender Spectrum, which is a great organization that works with schools and gender, they've sort of broken this into sort of segments. And so we see this rapid growth and development at the elementary level. And then once we get to sixth grade, we're thinking a lot more abstractly and can handle bigger, more complex analysis. And so there are lots of ways to be a boy and a girl. At this little age, kids are trying to just figure out where they associate. Kids could do or be anything that they like or they want. We're all individuals, and certain things aren't just for boys or girls. So can they play with this? Can they play with that? Absolutely, go ahead. Once you get into grades 2 to 4, they're trying to sort and see who can do what. And so gender is more complex. It's not about just our bodies. We all have a right to be who we are and be ourselves. We have the right to play with the toys that we want to play with. And this is a message that I think that a lot of us can get on board with. We've got this great diversity in DC. And what that means is that with this kind of diversity comes just a diverse background. And kids come to school with different ideas of who we are and what we're supposed to do. But I think at the end of the day, an educator can say, all people deserve to be treated with kindness and respect. No matter how we get here, no matter who we are and how we show up and whether we agree with this or that, we all deserve to be treated with kindness and respect. And then we see in grades 4 to 6, they're really trying to figure out who can play soccer and who can play frisbee and who can do these different things on the playground and in class. And so we're trying to really introduce, concepts to them that really kind of break this binary understanding of what you're allowed to do and who you're allowed to be. And, this is a great way you can introduce gender across culture, across history. You can really introduce that gender diversity that exists versus the binary system. And then once we get into middle and high school, we really can reiterate that conversation that people deserve respect, kindness, and empathy. You can normalize asking pronouns, and you can really prepare. This is the coolest thing. When you talk about gender and race and all this stuff at the middle and high school level, you really have the opportunity to help prepare students to live in a city like DC, where they can be active participants in a world where they're going to encounter people of different backgrounds, where their different backgrounds are going to be presented to the world. And so it's a pretty exciting time to talk about gender and stuff. So I'm going to pause here and ask you all where you think there might be an opportunity in your school to use inclusive messages about gender.
In communications to parents and guardians, in communications in assemblies and large school gatherings, using that and modeling that as educators and administrators when you're talking to students and learners. So those are really easy ways in conversation to do it.
Great, thank you. Myself to my own classroom, morning meeting messages, during head of school messages, absolutely. So and what I'm hearing in all of this is where you can really model it. You can model inclusive messages about gender, which I love. And so we're going to close real quick with this idea of intersectionality and how it's important for us to remain diligent about the privilege that we all bring into our classroom, because it takes very little to engage a student or to totally shut them down. And so I'm sure all of us as educators have heard of Kimberly Crenshaw and her concept of intersectionality, where it's really this metaphor to understand the ways that our various multiple layers of identity and inequality and disadvantage, sometimes it compounds itself. We've got our gender, we've got our race, we've got our socioeconomic status, all of this kind of sort of layers on top of it and creates obstacles that maybe the teacher at the head of the class can't quite always understand that's happening for a student. And so while most of our students in DC are students of color, it's about 80%, and we are blessed and so fortunate in DC to have so many educators of color, it's still important for us to recognize that there are 4 ways to really support a transgender student of color. And that is to listen to your students, to educate yourself and learn, which is what we're doing here today, acknowledge your privilege and recognize that you've got to really work harder around that perspective taking to understand where the student's coming from, and make sure to highlight their voice and stories in the curriculum, in the classroom, through policies, through all the ways that you show up for your students. And we're going to close out and just sort of a reflection on, we know that at least 2% of your students may be transgender, even if they haven't come out to you yet. We know that educators matter and that inclusive environments can dramatically improve outcomes for transgender students. We know it's okay to talk about gender in your classroom with your students at school, that you can make your classroom a window or mirror or a sliding glass door in your classroom, in your school. Transgender students bring a diversity of identities, including identities that also experience discrimination, such as race. And it's important to listen, learn, acknowledge our privilege, and highlight the stories of transgender students. And so I'm going to open us up for questions while we also close out and remind you all we've got 3 more sessions next week, next Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, all at 3:30 p.m. If you have not registered for them, please do. You've got the QR code in front of you. You take your little phone out and focus your camera on it, and then that should give you the page to register. We also posted the link in there for you. And I'm going to remind you again before you leave, please complete this session evaluation. Again, with your phone, you turn on your camera setting and you point it towards this QR code, and it should give you the website, the link that you can use to fill out our evaluation. And so we've got a question about yesterday's evaluation as well. Let's see if we can get that to Amber. If somebody has yesterday's evaluation, or maybe we can just email it to you so you can complete it. But everyone else, please stay right here and complete this session evaluation. Amber, go ahead and complete today's session evaluation, and we'll get you yesterday's. Perfect. Thank you. Right. That's how you'll get yesterday's evaluation. Email etaylor.doctor1@dc.gov. Everybody else, again, this is how we're going to give you your certificate of completion. You'll get one for each session that you attend and complete a session evaluation for. And I'm so excited. I'm glad we got to have this time together. I'm looking forward to next Tuesday, which will be our next session. And we're going to take a deep dive into the data. We're going to talk about the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, and we're also going to talk about mental health and sexual health and substance use and super exciting things that affect our students, and how students that identify as LGBTQ are overrepresented in some of these data, and think about strategies and resources in the community that we can help connect our students to try to counter some of that behavior that we know puts them at risk for poor health outcomes, for poor academic outcomes. And I'm really excited to have that conversation, especially I'm sure all of our data folks, our math teachers are going to love hearing about that. And how do you contact Deanna offline for additional questions? Feel free to contact me. Let me see if I can